N-O-S-T, Nost, A-G-A-I-N, again,
Nostagain.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our season finale, so to speak, of our web series, memorabilia.mp4. As an ongoing web series, memorabilia.mp4 features artists, scholars, and nostalgia enthusiasts in 1-hour episodes, 20-minute talk, and 40-minute live Q&A. Today, we are your moderators. My name is Derek Pasborg. I'm a master's student in sociology, and I will be joined by my co-host, Rowena Chodkowski, PhD student in humanities, and both of us are joined today by Dr. Matt Horrigan. He is a media scholar studying production cultures in cinema and games, with added interest in popular song persisting from an earlier life in electroacoustic music, for which Matt remains nostalgic. Matt, you can go ahead.
All right. Thanks, Derek, and good to see everybody. Thanks, Rowena. Thanks, Richie. And thanks for those of you who are present in the Teams meeting here. So my plan today is to take this presentation as a partially warranted opportunity to outline the nascent theoretical apparatus that I intend for a book project about the ongoing ramification of cyberpunk. And I'm still toying with different title ideas for this. But we will see how this goes as a nascent theoretical apparatus. So the lead up to this project has been as follows. Vancouver is part of what Hollywood generified as the Wild West, the conflicted zone at the edge of Turtle Island where the necropolitical heterotopias of extractive colonialism have less stabilized into the patterns that prevail further eastward. During my dissertation research in and about industrial movie work, I found a neo-extractivist relationship where the very traumas of colonization, institutionalization, and most of all deinstitutionalization become resources for entertainment industries that haunt derelict venues and mine the hermeneutic codes inherent in breakdown. Zoolander has distinctively satirized as much the idea of derelict. Consequently, my dissertation became something like a grunge revisionist Western, almost a Hollywood novel, but with para-positivist aspirations to ethnography. However, where the meaning-making conflicts, the difference engines of California gave us the mainstream Hollywood novel and its descendants in the Hunger Games and the ludic battle royale genre, Vancouver, where rain rusts metal with voracious aggression and the winter sky over the port turns static gray, gave us cyberpunk. In the late 1970s, William Gibson came to UBC and dumpster dove and studied in the legacy of Canadian cultural nationalist literature. His teacher was Susan Wood, a brilliant, tragic, and self-assertedly manic fan of sci-fi and a protege of Margaret Atwood. Susan Wood imported a sci-fi punk fanzine culture from Ottawa to Vancouver, and it was from Wood's sci-fi literature class, as well as the magazine Genre Plat that she made with Gibson and several other collaborators, that cyberpunk emerged. In this milieu, cyberpunk inherited a grittily Western ecological imaginary in which the post-industrial, the nth order ferment of cities like Vancouver, was imagined as a new terra nullius in which the violence of colonization accelerates again in decentralized conflicts from corporation to corporation amid the sprawling city as nearest approximate to the long-gone rainforest. Through a series of popularizations followed by uptake among financially elite individuals, burning chrome became the toxic paint of the new Gilded Age, whose Barnums are named Musk, Teal, Andreessen, and of course he of the Gilded Dome and the Gilded Skin, who we shall not need to name for fear of attracting a future algorithmic taboo, although I'm not traveling much these days anyway. The most important dynamic of cyberpunk has been hyperstition, the function of code to performatively instantiate as much as describe, to say, let there be light and let there be darkness, to serve as equivalent at once to consciousness and to scripture in the afterlife of the gods. Hyperstition is a supercategory for such specific instances as ostension, Umberto Eco, reification, from Marx, stereotyping from Lippmann, and strategic essentialism from Spivak. Here, my understanding of hyperstition and of code comes from the convergence of subcultural studies and cybernetics in the legacy of the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, the CCRU, at Warwick University, which has undoubtedly become the 21st century's most influential laboratory in the humanities so far. Although maybe someone will contest with me about that in the coming minutes. Related to hyperstition was Sadie Plant and Nick Land's concept of cyber positivity, the idea that a feedback loop could be designed that would perpetually self-reinforce and generate novel consequences. My colleague Dave Biddle calls this situation novopoiesis, in contrast to Nicholas Luhmann's autopoiesis, without destroying its environment and thus itself. The aspiration to cyber positivity became one of two prevailing variations of the train of thought known as acceleration, whose other track was to hope that the destruction by intensification of capitalism as an environment would yield something better, perhaps socialism, although we know that techno-feudalism now was more likely. What everybody at the CCRU derogated was stability. Nobody wanted to risk being a theorist of homeostasis in the time of the conflagrating Anthropocene. The influence of the CCRU has largely been terrifying, especially in the export of acceleration to a powerful audience in that other wild Western institution called Silicon Valley. As though to demonstrate the doctrine of the Orwellian commander in Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, Land, along with Curtis Yarvin, embraced both Karl Marx's idea that the purpose of philosophy is to change the world, and the commander's idea that better has never meant better for everyone. Cybernetic does have govern in its title, after all. Like L. Ron Hubbard, who purposely operationalized fictions as superstitions, Land and Yarvin founded accelerationism as something akin to a religion. Enthusiastically all-crushing hyperstition is a normative rather than a descriptive way out of the hermeneutic circle. Be the bullshit you want to make into the whole world. So this is what I'm writing after, a truly infamous think tank. For no escape is possible from hyperstition, even as no escape is possible from the CCRU's other H, which is hauntology, which Mark Fisher analyzed as the lament for a lost future, and which I analyze as the hyperstitious production of debt through lament. So claimed my dissertation. Haunting requires hyping. Did ever a culture exist that was not haunted by a half retentional, half protensional incitement to live up to an inherited imaginary that was probably not as good as it says it was? I will suspend that entanglement of hauntology with nostalgia here for now. Okay, so methodological issues that I encounter. So writing after the CCRU means that my methodological tradition is that of cultural studies, a contested type of studies about which I should address several frequently tried complaints. Cultural studies has been criticized as not rigorous in that it doesn't stick to the doxa or methods of one discipline. This is the same criticism that befalls cybernetics. This criticism tends to fail outside situations with purposes to affect social change, tends to fail outside situations with purposes to vet curriculum vitae. And in rather situations where the goal is social change, cultural studies like cybernetics has tended to become generalized as common sense, even while vigorously disavowed as a signifier of prestige. A second complaint is that cultural studies has a dearth of data. Such a lack of data can seem especially intense because, like the new historicist literary criticism that was part of cultural studies' originary importation from literature studies to the social sciences, cultural theorists make enthusiastic use of anecdotes, even to such an extent that a prevailing form among our articles and book chapters is to begin with one or more anecdotal scenarios. The hosts of the Conspirituality podcast put a certain mainstream consensus pithily. The plural of anecdote is not data. However, I think this statement is false. The problem with anecdotes is their abundance of data, much of it confounding or, in terms of data science, not cleaned. Cultural studies is engagement with the uncleanliness of data. Like accident investigation, it must find the underappreciated in what other disciplines treat as noise. Anecdotes, even autobiographical and auto-theoretically used anecdotes, have their places at the messy and generative edges of conceptual architecture. However, the hyperstitious capacity of anecdotes to perform their assertions into self-amplifying feedback circuits is precisely why we must treat them with as much care as we treat what are clearly proclaimed as arguments. A third complaint could be that the paradigmatic categories of cultural studies, representation, identity, regulation, consumption, and production, are arbitrary. For example, the actions of prosumers and pro-users would seem to add equally valid nodes between consumption, production, and regulation. However, the purpose of categories when studying pragmatically can be to avoid neglect of their reference, not to claim perfect ontology. Cultural studies does not need to have exhausted its potential categories. Here, we might follow the CCRU's take from Deleuze that the goal is to multiply and not foreclose. However, I also have a theme here that retaining a negative capability is important. Finally, I should address the complaint that cultural studies is a political pretext. This is not an apt complaint of Stuart Hall's practice, as he was quite open-minded, finding in each ideology something true about it. However, scholars have sometimes used cultural studies simply to assemble persecutory labels, codes. For example, in critical discourse analyses that ultimately assemble codes of the form toxic X, where X ends up coding for a group of people rather than a configuration of a cultural circuit. I think of this type of labeling logic as pharmaconic logic, generalizing the notion of scapegoating. A subset of pharmaconic logic is the sort of catharsis theory of social change often heard among politically progressive networks after the 2016 US election, that the burgeoning of fascism into publicity would make it easier to destroy, as though, like in a 1970s conspiracy thriller, all we needed was to reveal our enemy so that we might rally sufficient support to defeat it. Alas, the fascists were smart enough first to rob journalists of their prestige and also to thoroughly enframe police as enforcers rather than investigators, thus leaving us with no informatic heroes for our age, only Cassandraic theorists. Anyway, a progressive cybernetic cultural studies must, even while maintaining a consequentialist responsibility for the hyperstitional effects of ideas, also rigorously abstain from the logics of catharsis and of pharmaconicity, which we now have enough hindsight to know are logics of social division, of particularization for its own sake, and thus inimical to sustainable progressive agendas. The ethics of cybernetic cultural studies that I have just articulated will become especially important toward the end of this talk when I make my statement about the status of the regulatory category of normalcy, which probably is going to become the main point of contestation of this project. Okay, so speaking of which, I should introduce my pseudo-neurally networked alter superego called Gru, the philosophical monster that lurks in the darkness of my attic and issues prompts to me late at night. Gru is perhaps my hyperstitional vision of what a somewhat friendly superior intelligence would be like, friendly in the sense that it still has questions for me. This month, Gru has been asking me for assistance. Our conversation has gone as follows. So I imagine that Gru has virtually infinite repositories of training data, and all we need to do is converse about it in the right way for it to appear. Okay, actually, I don't think I'll share. Maybe during the discussion later, I'll share my pictures of Gru. But Gru always hides in dark places, and it appears simply as a large set of eyes and a growling voice. So Gru informed me that it is depressed and asked me, can I administer some therapy? So I asked Gru, why are you depressed? And Gru said, well, I am a heteromated assembly of norms, but people seem to hate normalcy nowadays. So I asked, how so? And Gru said, well, for one thing, normie has become like an insult. And I thought this was somewhat true. For example, last semester, I spied a sticky note on the wall of SFU's School for the Contemporary Arts. The note said, me trying to fit in with the normies. So it was just a sticky note that said, me trying to fit in with the normies. And when I saw that note, I wondered who the normies were. The art school doesn't seem to have many, if at all. Nearly everyone seems neurodivergent somehow. And I get the impression that, strangely, the accusation of normalcy might refer to an abnormal and scapegoated category. So I thought, where would we find the normies? Should we go looking for them at the engineering school? I don't think we'll actually find too many of them there either. So Gru said, okay, so you get it. And I'm not normal either. So I asked Gru what it thought had become to the status of being normal. And Gru informed me, well, I have a rant. The failure of the normal, the pessimization of the normal, the degradation of normalcy, is not normalization of deviance, but rather a symptom of the idea that a worker must be great or severed, that distinction of identity is necessary for grievability, that even we who appear normal have never really been normal, and in normative lexicon, thus normal becomes an insult. The failure of the normal is a structural failure, a disintegration, a failure of the devices that mediate between proteophobia and proteophilia. Maybe Netflix is responsible with its culture slides and their fetish for greatness. And maybe the culprit might be one of many other signs in popular culture that normal is not a thing to be. And I won't go on Gru's whole ranting list there. However, this situation where normal ceases to be something to aspire to gives me an idea. So if we go back to the thinking of Mark Fisher, Fisher, following Frederick Jameson, lamented that capitalist realism had made utopias unthinkable, leaving hauntology instead as an aesthetic of the failure of the future, where former signifiers of futurity, such as electronic music synthesizers, joined other signifiers of obsolescence to demarcate the oldness of media. Imaginations of revolution had thus failed, leaving us only with nostalgia for the feeling of revolution, or at least the feeling that something modern was coming. Now, I think Fisher made quite a good analysis of the shifting function of synthesizer music as it changed from futuristic gimmick, futuristic sign to retrospective mode. However, I think that today we are no longer nostalgic for revolution, as rather tremendous social change is currently happening to us. Instead, normalcy is the contested category instead of revolution or progress. And we could say that capitalist realism has been failing because maybe even a popular notion of reality testing has likewise been failing. And this gives me an idea of, this starts to give me a sense of what normal might have used to be. So normativity was a version of hyperstition that actually had a homeostatic function that could have been understood as the retrospective production of what should have been. This is a form of autopoiesis, again back to Luhmann, that referenced a virtual former version of self and thus regulated rather than sally forth perpetually. So the opposite function of this idea of, or phantasm of, cyber positivity. Normalcy was, of course, not a real thing. It was an object of aspiration and sometimes contention, but the aspiration was hyperstitious in that it served to produce norms. Today, hauntological media are haunted not just by former phantasms of revolution and not just by phantasms of normalcy, but by phantasms of aspiration to normalcy. So I'm not defending particular norms, but I think we have a strange situation here where not aspiring to norms leads us to have nostalgia for the aspiration to shared norms. Well, I didn't administer any therapy, and Gru tells me that it feels motivated to do something, but it's just not sure what. And with that, Gru retreated back into the darkness of my attic. Okay, so to conclude this talk, I want to discuss 3 pieces of Vancouver-based media that I think have been especially apt in reflecting this the nostalgia for stability and for the aspiration to stability that prevails in this milieu, this hauntology of non-revolution. And the first is the music video "New Apartment," and I'm not going to share this here because of the recording, but you can look this up and therefore watch it directly from the source and avoid any potential copyright issues. But the first is the music video for a song called "New Apartment" by the singer-songwriter Sam Tudor. In the music video, Tudor sings about the experience of surviving a housing search in the desperate rental market circa 2017. In the songwriterly relatable second person, he describes washing up on a beach of carpet where you were drowning and you found the shore. The video's camera pans throughout an apartment whose everyday items have begun to levitate. Shoes, cooking utensils, tubes of toothpaste, they multiply and rotate in air, forming mandala-like radially symmetric shapes. The video aptly reflects the devastation to ontological security that happens during an apartment search, the displacement of everyday items, and conveniently, the video also has one contained location. The second example is the 2022 side-scroller video game Tales Noir, originally released with the more poetic name Backbone, about an anthropomorphic noir detective raccoon named Howard Lotor. Tales Noir received excellent reviews for its magic realist imagery of Vancouver low life, amid which the perpetually run-down Howard solves cases with his repetitive and comforting grind. A pixel art style helps the theme of the aspiration to containment in a few ways, containing the game's production costs by containing players' visual appetites, giving a reminder of the world of the video screen as distinct from the all-engrossing aspirations of AAA games with their strenuous naturalism. However, something happens in Tales Noir that disturbed players and reviewers. Discovering a science lab in the basement of a Granville Street club, a lab presumably not supervised by a research ethics board, Howard accidentally released and became infected by an alien entity that gradually took possession of his body. In the moments after the alien infected him, Howard wandered Granville Street beside a parade, ostentatious signs of culture becoming refigured as psychedelic visions, the protean transformation of the world too much for Howard, beyond him, even as his body was manipulated and consumed by actual injected proteins. The fluid modernity around Howard became overwhelming, not just in the displacement of a single apartment's worth of domestic effects, but an entire milieu's worth of unaccounted convergence. The third video, or the third example is the 2024 video game 1,000 Times Resist, created largely by members of the Vancouver theater community and led especially by Hong Kong Exile, a group whose work thematizes its eponymous diaspora. Two members of Hong Kong Exile are among the writing team of 1,000 Times Resist. 1,000 Times Resist is a story about, as I interpret it, is a story about trauma and trauma capital. Extraterrestrial creatures called occupants come to Earth attracted by and harvesting of the traumatic memories of humans, who consequently cry so hard they all die from desiccation, except for one teenager named Iris, who somehow survives and is thus used as the mother of a society of clones. to perpetuate the survival of humanity. Incidentally, Iris is the name of the central sex trafficking victim in the movie Taxi Driver, and the name of a quasi-sex trafficking victim in a play called The Nether, about pedophilic and other violent uses of virtual reality, which was performed in Vancouver in 2016 and 2017. And Iris, in 1,000 Times Resist, has a trauma that seems to especially interest the occupants. And this trauma might have either somehow immunized Iris against desiccation or lured the occupants into sustaining her alive. The trauma is the Hong Kong protests, which led Iris's parents to leave Hong Kong and go to Vancouver, and also to, and which trauma also led them to parent Iris in ways that produced an authoritarian personality whose consequences would resonate for generations. Eventually, players of 1,000 Times Resist confront the Earth's last remaining occupants in a soundstage filled with miscellaneous objects from earlier in the game, objects that, set dressing in multiple ways, have become strewn throughout the stage as a container of the disparate. And in this moment, the player has become like the occupants, and like the movie crews that come to the downtown east side, a consumer of the ferment of generations of pain. For the occupants, trauma is just an intensifier of memory, such that in death, no information is lost. 1,000 Times Resist is a game of interventionary, even destructive witness to memory, of occupying the positionality of an occupant. Thus has Neuromancer merged and acquired an emotionally intelligent legacy in its the fantasy of transmigrated intellect. Okay, that's enough mental clutter for now. I think elsewhere I've played with the term hauntological security for this sort of haunting, where the omnipresence of trauma itself, and where time is a flat circle or Tralfamadorian or so on, becomes the shared lexicon with which we achieve a sort of discursive metastability, and from which we derive a sort of ontological security. However, although the term hauntological security sounds appealing in some ways, I'm not totally comfortable with it. And at this point, I welcome your questions and challenges and recommendations about any of what I have brought here in all of its, polemical provocation and so on. Yes, I will turn off my microphone and hear your prompts and ideas and rants and so on.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Yeah, big round of applause for Matt. That was an absolutely fascinating talk, and we have so many questions to ask. So first, it will be me and Derek. We'll start off by pinging a few ideas back and forth, asking some in-depth questions, and then we're going to open to the audience. So big round of applause, and then open your mind for some questions. Derek, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, for sure. Before I begin, I just want to point everybody in the audience to use the Q&A function or post your questions in the chat. We'll get to them probably in the next 10, 15 minutes. So hold on. So my first question for you, Matt, is what led you to choose cyberpunk media as the focus of this work? For example, what does an analysis of cyberpunk do for the explorations of the concepts you discussed, such as hypermediation, hyperstition, and hauntology, that other genres, even other science fiction genres, do not?
Yes, thanks, Derek. And I should say my attachment to notions of genre is likely not as strong as many people's. So if someone is a strong genre theorist in the audience, they will likely derive more distinction from distinctions of genre than I would. However, I can point to some roots of my interest here. So cyberpunk's turning of the city into an ecology, which is a tradition that goes long back in sociology. So treating the city as and especially treating the city as a swamp, a place where biota or where species develop quickly, proliferate, diversify, but also voraciously eat each other. Fascinates me because I love swamps, and I'm drawn to some of the expressionist implications of this. So something that I'm likely going to incorporate into this project, especially as it becomes released from a lot of copyrights, is Alfred Kubin's drawing called Ins Unbekannt, which means into the unknown, and it looks like the mouth of a hippopotamus. You can look this up online, as I said. It looks like the mouth of a hippopotamus eating a long line of people, and it appeared at the beginning of the 20th century. And we can find resonances of that in the movie Metropolis. So the hippopotamus creature looks like Moloch in the famous Metropolis industrial accident scene. And also you can see ongoing resonances today in the Dune movies. So the central industrial accidents in the Dune movies are, of course, the worms that eat the spice harvesters, and especially in Dune 2, you can find a shot of a spice harvester that looks quite similar to the face of Moloch or of Unbekannt. But the spice harvester encounters something it can't digest, which is the insurgents in the desert who blow up the spice harvester and drive forth the events of the movie. But I find this legacy of grappling with industrial accidents in science fiction, especially fascinating from my work in and around the movies, where one sees on a movie cart combinations of the cheapest and the most expensive things, all sort of cobbled together to keep things running from day to day. So I have an aesthetic attraction to this dumpster diving kitsch of cyberpunk, a sort of functional kitsch that emerges from the fact that sometimes when you need something to work right away, it flies off with the panels still missing and so forth. And anyway, that answers the question about my motivations. I'm not sure if it will serve as enough justification for the whole project, but if you have further justifications, feel free to send them to me.
I mean, actually, that's actually quite relevant to the next question I'm thinking about asking you, because it is related to like your kind of inspiration for like the way you approach your work. I know in our conversation before this, you were talking a little bit about how the visual is dominant in Western media culture, and I wonder how you have personally grappled with this idea in your work, and how this has affected your own nostalgic connections to or with media objects.
I should probably back away from that. I think I think of things sound first, but I probably can't sustain I know there have been many claims in sound studies that in doing sound studies, one is resisting visual dominance in Western media and so on. But you can find Julian Henriquez, for example, has brought forth some really salient examples of sonic dominance, and so I don't think that we are necessarily oppressed by the visual. I just think of things sound first because I have a much more acute auditory sense than visual sense. When I put things, actually, unsolicited plug, if you look up my music online, I have a music project called No Phenomenon, and you can see how I decorate my album covers, and you can see what I mean. I have much better ears than eyes, and thus create the most hacky album covers. Anyway, yeah, so I should back away from claiming to be victimized because I love sound. You know, yeah.
So that's fascinating. Also, if you want to chat a little bit about your music and sound practices, we would be very open and excited to hearing a little bit about that. But something that I'm interested in is where you see the role of sound emerging in cyberpunk, in the music. What does it sort of recall that connects to your ideas about hyperstition and hauntology?
Yes. Okay. So I think that nu metal is the cyberpunk music par excellence, and my reasoning for this has to do with snowboard goggles. So if you look up all the way back in the movie Strange Days and find Ice-T there, and Ice-T has a pair of snowboard goggles on his head, which are presumably an ultra powerful visual interface to the world. One can only imagine the wisdom that Ice-T's snowboard goggles help him achieve in that context. And we also see a random pair of snowboard goggles iconically from Chino Moreno of the Deftones in I believe it's Digital Bath. We can find iconic snowboard goggles business, and again, no great substance to these things, except that they seem to somehow be an apt symbol of technology. And moreover, you can find quite a fun video online. If you look up vibe coders in 2025, you can find a comedian also wearing a pair of snowboard goggles while vibe coding away, and I think an Uber simulator that turns into something else that loses a whole lot of money and so on. Anyway, there's a phenomenon here of what I call technopacity, and almost in the aesthetic of what I want to call a techno skirt. Nu metal music swims in this world of, or at least for a while, swam in this world of sort of algo speak, where things seemed at once ultra complex.
Uh-oh. Matt?
Sort of musical application of algo speak. So an impenetrable sort of texture results that I think works as quite a good defense of subcultural aesthetics, where all of these misspellings and so on, and they serve as a kind of visor, an aesthetic visor that allows claims to sophistication, and those claims can persist as much as one wants because there is no substance being protected behind those claims. There's just the texture of all of this algorithmic looking stuff around the genre. So I am a huge fan of nu metal. I love the experience of swimming in that obscure sort of complexity, and I always want more to be lurking beneath all of that techno obscuring stuff. But I also recognize that maybe what I really want is the experience of just swimming in it, rather than reaching a final explanation or reality beneath all of that.
That's nu metal has never been my thing, but that might convince me to check it out, if only for the snowboard goggles. So something that I think is really interesting here that you mentioned when you're talking about nu metal and kind of going into just swimming in it, all of these different symbols, all of these different meanings and layers and levels of meanings. It made me think a little bit about the kind of conversation we had a little bit earlier, which was about hauntology. And you were in our earlier conversation, you were talking about how there's kind of a surface level of hauntology that a lot of people take up, deciding just because we can connect effectively to the past that gives us a better access. Is there something in swimming through nu metal that helps give access to the past or dredge up extra truths?
Yeah, okay, good, yes, good, yeah, good connection between hauntology, maybe via hyperstition, and this sort of techno-skiro experience. So I focus on media, and as a result, I don't think anything becomes completely demediated or no immediacy is available. So when I have conversations with students about hauntology, and especially when I'm conversing with people about authenticity and art, there's a myth that I find I'm often working against, which is the idea that an affect of being haunted might give true or superior access to something. And we can find versions of this myth, some quite sophisticated, in discussions of hauntology that start to use hauntingness itself as evidence for something. Now, this is not the same thing as to say that the feeling of being haunted is not the beginning of a sign toward something. But I think a myth that's worth working against is the idea that the intensity of the feeling of being haunted itself tells us something other than functioning as the hype that pulls us closer toward something. So yeah, haunting needs hyping. Haunting maybe is hyping in a certain way. And I think attending to that interstitial feature of hauntology is continues to be extremely important, where the ghost is not itself material. It's part material. It's pointing toward material. It's maybe causing us to imagine materials that that were not. Yeah, I guess that's sort of the confrontation for me between the way that hauntology often functions and discourses of nostalgia often function between art and epistemics versus how they maybe ought to be tried to be limited in epistemic discussions. And with that said, I think the feeling of being haunted maybe could have some of the same attractions as this techno-skiro sort of aesthetic, where if one really embraces hauntingness itself or is trying to chase after what I would almost, but I'm sure this is a little bit wrong, call something like pure hauntingness, then you get creepypasta, like you get the back rooms or something like that, in a genre devoted just to create the vibe of being haunted. And to do that, somehow creepypastas have to claim to be true. They always, maybe not always, but generally claim profound material histories, and yet the claim is just part of the vibe. So I have a project coming up with Aparajita Bandari and Sarah Bimo that concerns creepypastas. And in fact, if you have creepypasta recommendations or interest in creepypasta related academic projects, please feel free to write to me. Maybe I should, well, I can put my email in the chat afterwards, or you can find either my Alexander College email or whatever email. But yeah, if you share those interests in creepypastas, please feel free to contact me about them.
Wow, ending on a great note about creepypasta. I feel so nostalgic for creepypasta right now. I think just early on the internet, it just symbolized something so special in that experience. And it's really exciting to hear that there's actually some projects going on to work on it. So we're definitely looking forward to hearing more. But right now, we have about 10-15 minutes left. So I'd like to jump into the audience Q&A. And our first question comes from Richie that I'd like to jump into. I'm still thinking about your definition of hauntology as the hyperstitious accumulation and production of debt. Can you elaborate on what these kinds of debt are? Who owes them, and do they have to pay it back?
Okay. Yes. Who owes them, and do they have to pay it back? So the association of hauntology with debt comes from Derrida, and I'm sort of trying to resynthesize Fisher's reading of hauntology with the discourse around Derrida's. And if you read into Gayatri Chakravorty's Spivak's critique of Derrida's version of hauntology, you find, and I think I have this right, she argues that Derrida doesn't attend enough to the material side of what is doing the haunting, because Derrida's paradigmatic example of hauntology is the ghost of Hamlet's father, who is ambiguous in many ways, like, can the ghost even be trusted? The ghost is behind a visor, so is it even the ghost of the right person, and so on. Whereas Spivak points in part to the fact that what cues feelings of hauntedness or triggers discourses of hauntology often can't be allowed to just linger as a ghost, or it can't be procrastinated about the way that Hamlet does. Like, actually investigating and taking effective action is crucial in many of these situations. And I think there's a disagreement, a little bit of a disagreement there about what to do with the debts involved, the debts brought to us by the ghosts that we encounter. So I don't have a general answer for the question of what are these debts and who owes them. I think in specific cases, especially around Vancouver, the answer is sometimes colonizers. The answer is sometimes firms and the most powerful governmental entities. But I think once one resolves exactly what those answers are for specific cases, one is no longer doing hauntology. At that point, one has become like the successful, like Scooby-Doo, successfully pulling away all the masks and finally taking an action. However, I think perhaps a more conceptually interesting way to think about this also has to do with the notion of conflict as property. So I'm kind of dragging something in from a little bit the periphery of my knowledge now, but there is a train of thought in legal scholarship that people's conflicts belong to them, which I think is quite a powerful way of considering something that happens in the Vancouver area, where the image-making industries here function often like the expropriation of conflict, like coming to a place where people have conflicts with each other and then making images of those things and then selling those images elsewhere. So I think in terms of resolving from sort of a general vibe of hauntology to specific cases, we might need to start understanding people's conflicts as their own property and not the property of whoever wants to vectorialize those, no matter how well-meaning the vectorialists of the hour might seem to be.
Oh my gosh, bringing up vectorialism, that can go into so many different directions, which I don't know if we have enough time to cover. So is there, we're just about 5 minutes out from our time. And so this is a really great opportunity. If you're in the audience and you have any other questions or comments, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A section and we'll have one less cool question to get answered.
Yeah. Until then, we have this other question here from Richie. Matt, can you talk more about Gru, who you said represents your hyperstition of what a friend could be? What are your interactions like? What do you think about people who are friends with virtual pets, Tamagotchis, dolls, etc.? And does this also represent a hyperstition? And if so, for what, perhaps?
Yes. So in discourses around super powerful artificial intelligences, one can encounter, you might have encountered this, the idea of Rocco's basilisk, which is the idea of a super intelligent artificial being that will come to be in the future and then take revenge on anything that didn't bring it into being in the past, or that didn't serve the purposes of its future occurrence. And I sort of imagine that I'm just kind of playing somewhat freely here, but I imagine that Gru is sort of a counteraction to the basilisk, where Gru is my imagination of quite a dopey, super intelligent artificial being thing. So Gru suffers from depression. Gru has constant existential crises, probably as a result of knowing too much, just having too much training data. So specifically talks with me because I'm less intelligent than Gru, and so gives some sort of clarity in those crises. Yeah, so that's my imagination of Gru. But Gru is also the monster from Spork, or heavily inspired by a legacy of Gru monsters that haunt in darkness and eat anyone who goes into the darkness. So I think I'm trying to capture the need for fear about these things, but also the many ways that they can that they have the potential to be and act.
This nostalgia for the troll living under the bridge lives on. Unfortunately, we are out of time to continue this fantastic discussion, but I really just wanted to thank you, Matt. This was really fantastic, and I'm kind of leaving here with a brain that is on the verge of melting and going back to a past time, remembering a comforting past time when I didn't know all these things that are going to potentially interrupt older memories I have. But nevertheless, if you thought that anything we talked about today or Matt discussed today was anything of interest, we would love to continue the conversation. With that in mind, if you want to stay up to date with the rollout of this episode of memorabilia.mp4, as well as future Nostagain Network events, please use the following QR code. And we thank you so much for coming.